So maybe you could tell me a little bit about the first research that you engaged in.
Yeah. Well, let's see. My first research would have been as a doctoral student, as with most folks. I was at the Ohio State University, and I was interested in how school principals become socialized into being principals. and that, like most doctoral students, I think, drew on my own experience. I find that often doctoral students want to do research based on something to do with them, right? We all are a little narcissistic in that sense, I guess. My experience moving from being a teacher to being a principal had been quite surprising to me, because I fancied myself very pro-teacher, and I wasn't going to lose that perspective. And within 6 months as a principal, I was already, griping about teachers not being in the hall for classes, and so I found I had to catch myself being sort of socialized into this new role, this new set of role expectations, right? And so I thought what I was probably going to use was sort of role theory, classical sociological role theory and role expectations and how those shift and so on. And I began looking at because I think for a lot of folks, it starts with finding where to locate yourself in the literature, right? So people often say, oh, I want to study X, but have no clue of what's been done, or whether this is a new topic or way too broad or whatever. I did identify a little bit of professional socialization literature in our field, but the sort of classic work that I used was Howard Becker's Boys in White, which was a ethnography that he did of medical residents or interns becoming doctors. And that, I think for every new researcher, reading a lot of studies is probably the best way to get to know how to do it, having those exemplars. And one of the things I think we don't do enough in graduate school is have our students read dissertations, right? We assign them all kinds of articles and things in doctoral seminars, but they can actually go through an entire doctorate very often without having ever read a dissertation and picked apart a good dissertation to see how it's constructed strategically and so on. And yet that's what we expect them to produce at the end, right? So unless they kind of do it on their own, which many of them do, or they read them as part of their research, they don't often get to actually see what one looks like, or what several look like. But so reading a lot of dissertations and reading a lot of book-length ethnographic studies, I think is important. And I think Boys in White became my kind of template, although I moved away from it later and read a few others. I also was interested in the sort of macro level issues of things like how social class and race worked in the districts I was studying. Like, how do principals think about those more structural kinds of things in their work, which are not necessarily naturals, particularly back in those days. Obviously, in most places, I did my work in Columbus, Ohio, because I was at Ohio State. So obviously, like any other urban area, there are the wealthy suburbs, and there's the inner city, and et cetera, et cetera. And so all of that becomes sort of the context within which principals do their work. And yet it's a kind of, I found, a hidden discourse. Like, it's not talked about, it's not considered polite to talk about social class or race or those kind of things, or there tends to be a kind of defensive discourse about it. So I became interested in this issue of not just the socialization, but also how they dealt with these broader contexts of class and race. And that was where I was trying to bring sort of critical theory, and my other model at that point was Paul Willis's Learning to Labor. So I had like Howard Becker and Paul Willis, as my kind of models. One which probably excessively layers on a Marxist analysis to the data, and the other that essentially is the more sort of innocent ethnographer that's not ideological. So I had those two extremes going. But I learned a lot by looking at how these different ethnographers approached their work. What happened as I was gathering data, I was interviewing principals, I was interviewing some of the parents in these. I chose a suburban principal, I chose a principal in a sort of more or less urban but more working to middle class kind of community, and then I chose a principal in the really poor neighborhood where the school was actually naturally integrated with poor white Appalachian kids and poor black kids. So it was, class-wise, it was all poor kids, but it was racially integrated. And I was interested in the different discourses, these principles. I started moving a little bit away from socialization per se, because I didn't find that literature, either the role theory literature in sociology or the socialization theory, particularly dynamic or useful. And around that time, I started reading an article by Meyer and Rowan that came out in 1977. Now, I was doing my dissertation work in the mid-'80s, so it was actually a fairly new article back then on institutional theory. I don't remember if it was called that at the time. And it was about sort of legitimation rituals and the ways that in organizations people engage in these legitimation rituals as a way to sort of protect the technical core of the organization, the classroom and the teachers and so forth. That became, for me, very theoretically important because I began to see that what these principles were doing was engaging in these kinds of legitimation rituals around class and race. So in the suburban district, they were expected, it was sort of the hidden discourse. It wasn't talked about because essentially there weren't too many poor people or minority people in the district, right? But I also interviewed some of the African American people who lived there and various parents, and so they had a whole different view of it. So I was able to get these different perspectives. It was actually, as I think back on it, I had three heavily ethnographic, I was in these schools a lot, interviewing a lot of the folks in those communities in those schools. I probably gathered way too much data. So, one of the things that I think for doctoral students, because you don't know quite how much necessarily you need, I probably ended up only analyzing maybe a third of my data because it was just so overwhelming and so much and so forth. So I would sort of caution people to maybe, gather less data in some case. Sometimes with doctoral students, maybe some of the pressures to finish and so forth, maybe they're not gathering enough data, right? And then you have the other extreme where they're probably gathering too much data.
Can I ask you a quick question
Sure.
about that? So I had a similar experience in that I had 3 different locations and was doing kind of comparative ethnographic research.
Right.
And I'd say probably about the same, about a third, maybe a little bit more than a third of my data were ever analyzed. But I'm not sure that I would have been able to analyze the third I did without that full experience. So I'm wondering
That's
how
a good
you
point.
think about kind of the experience versus the data itself.
How much it is sort of tacit knowledge that you're developing that you may not be explicitly analyzing. I don't know. I certainly gathered all the data, so I was using the data in that sense. I guess what I'm saying is the more formal analysis was probably only about a third, but I guess I probably did in some sense more informally analyze all of the data because as I was looking at this data, obviously these other interviews were in there somewhere and I was making connections, but I maybe wasn't coding all of it, right? So, it's, they talk about this sort of saturation point kind of thing, and I don't know that I reached that in any of the 3 districts. I probably, at the same time I'm saying I probably gathered too much data, I don't know that it wouldn't have been useful to continue gathering data in those districts. And in hindsight, maybe I should have only done two districts instead of 3, right? So that's I guess the inexperience of being a doctoral student is knowing kind of how to think through those things. because actually I ended up mostly using data from the low income and the suburban district in my analysis for a lot of reasons, but so I discovered this institutional theory, and I think one of the things that for any doctoral students listening to this that's important is to continue reading as you're gathering data. So this constant comparative idea of constantly comparing theory and data, I would add literature to that. So you're constantly comparing your kind of your frameworks with your data, but also with continuous reading in the literature, because as you're reading literature, you're beginning to see connections to your data or not. So you'd read an article and you say, yeah, this doesn't really say anything to my data, and then suddenly you stumble onto something, as I did, like the Myron Rowan piece, where I'm thinking, oh my God, this is really like congruent with what I'm seeing. And so that was very exciting. And of course, institutional theory became a big deal after that, and now you have neo-institutional theory and so on. So, and the whole loosely coupled idea and the legitimation rituals and so on, isomorphism, all of those concepts then began to sort of help me understand what was going on with these principals and the pressures they were feeling to, I guess now we would call it the pressures in a marketized system to PR their schools around selling their schools. In that case, it wasn't so much that. They weren't like recruiting students or anything. They were legitimating their schools to their environment, to their communities and so forth. And so a lot of what they talked about had that element of, like, we don't really talk about race here or class, because it's kind of embarrassing because we're a wealthy suburb and we just don't talk about that. But they never said that, but that was kind of the subtext of it. And then at the really poor school, you had another version of that, which also was, oh, we're naturally integrated. We have black and white students here. But to point out that they're all really poor was, so it, those were sort of the way my study went from a theoretical standpoint. I didn't end up really using a kind of Paul Willis, exactly, neo-Marxist analysis, even though I was very interested in issues of class and how in a district that's divided by wealthy suburbs and inner city and all that, how principals legitimated those inequalities essentially. I mean, that was kind of that they weren't obviously doing it intentionally, but part of their job, essentially, as a principal, was to make the the sort of unacceptable levels of social inequality appear to be acceptable and normal. And so it was a kind of normalizing discourse. And so I kept going back into the data to make sure I wasn't layering that on and looking for different counter negative cases and things like that. So I was at that time I had just read Glaser and Strauss, so I was doing some of the analytic induction stuff, but at the same time I was reading Paul Willis, and so it was an interesting and I was a doc student and learning, right? So that was my initial experience with qualitative research. And then I ended up getting academic jobs with very heavy teaching loads. Like at New Mexico, I taught a 3-and-3 load, had a lot of doc students, and I was at Cal State LA for a while. So I really didn't have a lot of time to do, and I didn't get any big grants to buy out courses. So the qualitative work that I've done over my career has come in sort of fits and starts and not full-blown ethnographic pieces. So I did a Fulbright in Mexico, gathered some data there on, did kind of a comparative study with my wife, Catherine Herr, on the kids in Mexico, again, different social class schools, but this time focusing on kind of in-depth interviews with kids, and then some in-depth interviews with kids back in New Mexico. And so that was, sort of my next qualitative study. And then I got really interested in discourse analysis and, critical discourse analysis of policy texts and things like that. So I started doing some studies I did one of the the exam for educational administrators, the state exam in New York, and the bulletin and the state standards, and did sort of a critical discourse analysis of the exam, because in the bulletin they give you the answers that people gave and the ratings the scorers gave and what the scorers said about the answers and so forth. And so I was able to sort of compare the standards with the scorers and that discourse and look at the various contradictions within those discourses and things. So I got really sort of interested, and also in a pragmatic sense, you know, without the time to do full-blown ethnographic work, I was looking for methods that I could do were fairly rigorous, but not necessarily, you know, field-based. Mm-hmm. And I think that there are now a lot of interesting methods that we can use besides the sort of traditional ethnographic methods, particularly in this policy context where texts become increasingly important. And of course, you know, Dorothy Smith's work in institutional ethnography really does place texts as central to our understanding in an age when people are constantly interfacing with text, whether it's poor parents choosing schools and having to deal with the texts from the school district on school ratings and so on and so forth, of how people interface with text, I think is really increasingly important. So now I'm learning network analysis is my latest thing. So I've over the years, I think I've just, one of the things I think we have to keep doing is learning new methods as they, you know, GIS and all these kind of new methods, the spatiality stuff, and I guess because I'm with this policy networks, I just realized that I need to understand how to study networks. Mm-hmm. It's not like I just chose it randomly, but you know, I mean, learning new methods as you're asking new questions and needing to, you know, either brush up or actually dig into some methods. So critical discourse analysis, network analysis, a couple of methods that I've been using lately. But I would say that, again, probably because of my English background, you know, I'm very comfortable with more essayist kind of work. Mm-hmm. And I think that should be viewed as more, I think we are overly empirical. Mm-hmm. And so everybody's producing all these empirical studies that are going out there, but there isn't enough, I think, work that's thoughtfully sort of looking at this body of work and kind of almost like literary criticism, you know, saying, well, let's look at this work around X and what is this really saying, and sort of pull back and do that sort of meta-analysis of our research. A really good book review or a really good, you know, can kind of get at that sometimes. But there's, I think, not enough sort of critique out there or debates. You know, there used to be a journal called Interchange or something. It was a Canadian journal. It may still be around. But it was basically founded on this idea of dialogue and debate around issues and studies and so forth. I think there's not enough of that out there now. So, you know, we're all asked to write blurbs and book reviews of our friends' work. You know, it's like, it's getting a little too, or somebody's doc student reviews their work. It's getting a little too friendly, you know? And I think there needs to be more, you know, authentic. Like, I'm writing a review for a colleague of mine, and I said, well, I'm going to warn you, you know, it's going to be, you know, I, as a matter of principle, I always include a critique of any book I review. Mm-hmm. So I give the good and the bad. So I don't want to lose your friendship, you know.
Do you really want me to do this?
Right. So, you know, so I would say that a lot of the work I've done is not empirical. Mm-hmm. And I think that's unfortunately seen as sort of a deficit nowadays, but I think that good conceptual essayist kind of work can actually be very powerful and very important. And again, that comes out of the sort of literary criticism background that where we don't necessarily, in the humanities, we think differently about some of these issues. I think education has been overly influenced by the social sciences, psychology primarily, but even with sociology and political science and anthropology, you know, we're still in that social science paradigm, and the humanities, I think, get sort of I mean, if empirical qualitative research is soft, imagine what humanities, you know, analyses are viewed as, you know, whether it's historians still get some respect, but
increasingly little.
Not as much.
Yeah. That has been a very strong turn in comparative and international education as well, which is my subfield, and
right.
a real turn away from kind of philosophical and historical approaches, much to the detriment of the field.
And we're getting fewer. The philosophers are on their way out, and the economists are coming in, and you know, there's just a shift. The old kind of curriculum theory field, which was a place for a lot of that, journal of curriculum theorizing. A lot of those journals are there are no openings for curriculum theory anywhere. The kind of stuff Michael Apple, you know, does, Janet Miller, you know, those kind of people. There's no space for that anymore. So it is, I think, a loss because now we have had the increase in sort of cultural studies, which is an interesting juxtaposition with qualitative research and cultural studies, right, and how they sort of interact or don't or whatever, and you know, how to do, you know, media, you know, cultural studies of media, or cultural studies of schooling and things like that. And I think that's an area that deserves more. There's some new emerging journals in cultural studies and critical cultural studies and discourse and so forth, but they are often not necessarily education journals. They're sometimes, you know, more broadly defined. There's some solid action research journals, educational action research, and also there's a British action research journal that publishes good work. But again, this question of the proliferation of journals is kind of good news, bad news, because now, like, there's a very specific journal about, I think, like, black males. So in some ways, we're sort of ghettoizing some of these areas where typically only people will read those journals who have a very specific interest in that particular topic, right? So I think for some of us, at one time, I think the proliferation of different journals and special interest groups and so forth worked for those of us that needed a space that wasn't available otherwise to have the debates and, you know, publish stuff. But now I find that many of us have moved to the margins and aren't publishing as much in the mainstream journals where we should be publishing, perhaps. AERJ, you know, so because there's a perception maybe that our work won't be published there. And of course, journal editors will often say, it's not that we don't want to publish this stuff, we don't get submissions, which I think to some extent is probably true.
We need to start flooding then.
So if you're in comparative education, you know, I read the comparative ed review, but because I have that sort of a side interest of mine, but I'll bet most people don't. And so having a comparative ed piece in Ed Researcher or AERJ or these journals it's going to be part of the, you know, in some ways I think we're losing that general conversation that we can all participate in, and becoming more and more specialized in our own sort of little bailiwicks.
Both methodologically, and I would say from a comparative international perspective, it's also very deeply related to context. So I think ARJ, for example, is much more likely to publish some large cross-national study that includes the U.S. and many other countries than it is to publish a piece that is entirely about another country, but that very evidently could help inform what's happening in the U.S. So I think there's also a lot of division right now between domestically focused folks and...
Although my view on that is that sometimes I see an article about Uganda, and it's framed as, this is an article about Uganda, so I think, well, yeah, I don't really have any particular interest in Uganda, I'm probably not going to read that. But if it were framed as, this is an article about high-stakes accountability or, some particular topic that I am interested in, and it happens to take place in Uganda, I probably would read it, right? And I often do when it's clear to me that this is something that an issue I'm interested in, even if you're not a comparativist, right? And so I think some of that gets back to how we frame our work and how we get it out there and how we get people to read it.
I think that's very, very true, and I think it's harder for people. I think it's harder for ethnographers. I think you see the same thing in the U.S. as well, with ethnographers being more likely to say this is about this place and this time, and looking at high stakes accountability, as opposed to other research traditions that might feel much more comfortable framing themselves as about a big problem, and it just happens to occur. The work happens to occur in X place. So I think there's also that tension about kind of acknowledging the centrality of context.
Right, or maybe it's writing 2 articles, one for the comparativists and one for ART.
That's right. Or 3 or 4.
All right, right.
So you said something that really interested me. One of the things that I've struggled with a lot with graduate students here is tensions around how to kind of play with theory and how to explore literatures. And I think there's sometimes a tendency for graduate students to try to kind of grasp a theory or a body of literature and stick pretty closely to it throughout their writing.
And sometimes they're even told you need a theoretical framework, right? And I'm constantly debunking that in my own students because they keep getting told that by my colleagues. I don't know, even though I've sort of challenged it. I said, no, you need a repertoire of theoretical frameworks, right, that you can pull on as needed or as relevant. And that takes a long time to develop that repertoire. But that's partly, I think, what graduate school is about, is developing that repertoire. And then I often tell students, think of it as a conversation you're entering, right? What's the conversation you're participating in and gathering your data around? And then it becomes obvious that you have to stay in that conversation as you're gathering your data. And you have to continue to read articles within that conversation, particularly nowadays when if you're, just 1 year policy shifts, there's new literature, there's, your stuff, the shelf life of your stuff, in New York City I had students studying a particular reform, and by the time they were halfway through their study, the reform was changed, which sometimes is a nice serendipity that you can see, kind of like that Linda McNeil ethnography where suddenly she saw that shift and documented it, But typically, then the students are like, whoa, this is like yesterday's reform, now what? So continuing to sort of keep up with the literature, see where the conversation is going as you're gathering data, I think makes for a much richer analysis of the work. So if all you're doing is taking neo-institutional theory as your framework and filtering all of your data through that, then of course you're going to come out with some kind of, you're going to find isomorphism and legitimation rituals and all the stuff that the theory provides you, the template to find, right? Now in my case, it became apparent to me with the socialization role theory that it wasn't kind of panning out. Or it wasn't, it's kind of like ho-hum, so what, So when I did identify that literature, it helped me explain things I was seeing that I had no interpretive framework to understand. Mm-hmm. So the aha moment for me was, oh, I see what's going on here. This helps me see what's going on here. So it wasn't like a sledgehammer that then, everything's a nail. It's more like, oh, I hadn't thought of it this way before, right?
How do you recommend that students do that searching? What are the mechanisms that you think are most useful?
Well, I think that they have to get into the conversation they're studying early on, and then they have to keep following it. And I think that's the hardest part for a lot of doc students. I had a doc, and part of that is also from their faculty, like faculty saying, oh, this is what you're thinking about? Well, here's something you might read, or that's where we come in, I think, to some extent. Or referring them to somebody who, there's somebody who does this work at Stanford, you need to contact them and they'll give you, so I think we need to share beyond our own institutions more often and assume we have other colleagues willing to help out. But I think what often happens too is students come in with solutions looking for problems. So I have a student now who's wanted to study restorative justice in schools as an alternative discipline to zero tolerance, right? And was convinced that that was the answer, and if we just do this, it'll solve all of our problems of race, class, and gender, and blah, blah. And so it was hard work to sort of get her to problematize that notion that this is the answer. Then she discovered Foucault, and if you put chairs in a circle, that can actually increase the surveillance, because at least in rows you can hide out in the so she got that whole idea of, well, maybe this restorative justice thing is just a velvet glove, and then she became this conspiracy theorist about this. Maybe we're better off with zero. And I said, no, that's not what we're talking about, And then finally she got to the point where she really could say, oh, this is something that is probably going to start happening more and more in schools as we critique zero tolerance, but is it really going to, unless it's implemented in some authentic way, is it really going to end up decreasing the referrals of kids of color to detention and all these kind of things? Or is it just another technique, to increasingly pathologize kids of color and so on? So now she has a real question, right? And I think it's getting to that point where you really don't have the answers, or you have some idea of the answers, or you may have your bias about the answer, but to be able to be completely open as you go into it, and the ability to be surprised. And that's what I often tell my students is, are you willing to be surprised, or are you willing to be wrong? Is that a real option for you? And if it's not, then you're not being reflexive, which is a requirement for any good research, qualitative or quantitative, right? Yeah.
And that description of kind of the shifts that often need to occur, swings that often need to occur as students search for new ideas.
Yeah, it's absolutely normal that people go through that period, and it requires time to make those shifts. And which is why, students who see their graduate work as sign of, well, I knocked off another 3 credits, I'm almost done, those students are not going to get involved deeply in the conversation. So it then becomes pleasing the instructor or whatever. It's not a real doctoral experience. So it really has to be a journey, being part of a conversation, struggling with the conversation, continuing to challenge yourself, continuing to read more, read outside go outside the discipline, because in public health, they're probably dealing with some similar things, but they're coming at it in a really unique and different way, So I think that's how scholars develop, And then the methodology and all that kind of stuff doesn't matter as much as the sort of the stance. It kind of gets back kind of Marilyn Cochran Smith and Susan Lay, research as stance, right? Your stance toward the topic you're studying is one of critical inquiry. And the methodology is almost less important.
What was the most generative mistake you ever made?
Generative in what sense?
In either the way that you were thinking, or in kind of the trajectory that you were on as a researcher, as a person?
Right. I don't know if I can point to one, but I would say that as we get to know ourselves as researchers, we kind of know what our vulnerabilities are and where we can make those mistakes. And I would say in my case, I tend to over-theorize data. So I have to constantly, and I think that comes out of my literary my English background. So, when you're interpreting a novel or a poem, you have a lot of license to bring in stuff. And so I sometimes treat my data in a similar way. I get really creative with it. And I have to distinguish between that, like say what a Patty Lather might do, or that kind of coming up with some kind of interesting and creative analysis of the data. There's a kind of priority to that, and not just, well, the 5 themes, across case themes, that kind of like really boring qualitative research that is like 80 or 85% of the studies out there, So, I think that I have a tendency to want to get a little too fancy sometimes, or a little too theoretically innovative, and maybe make more out of a piece of data than is actually there. And so then I have to be careful that I'm not sort of cherry picking things out that fit that, and to really go back in and say, is this really, or to deepen that and make it more nuanced than to have sort of the easy theoretical finding. So I would say that's my struggle. And for some, I think it's that it's being too cautious with the data, Yeah.
Thank you.
Do you have pieces that you would really encourage people to pick up and read?
I certainly have my favorite pieces. I just saw Mats Alvesson, the Swedish qualitative researcher. He has some really interesting pieces on how to generate a research question. His idea of boring research and interesting research. So his thing is how to do interesting research. So I'll send you a couple of his pieces. Otherwise, I'd have to think a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
for taking
Nancy.
the time to
This has been fun.
speak with all of us.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great fun.
Hope it's helpful.
Oh, it is.